So when these new pump flange sizes came out and lactation consultants began experimenting with them, we found that many, many, many people need much smaller sizes than what comes with the pump, at least.
Okay.
So most pumps come with like around a size 24 flange, and often also a 27 or a 28, depending on the brand.
Okay.
Most people need something like a 17 millimeter
Really?
size.
Hi guys, I'm your host Megan Van Diepender, and this is the Empowerhood Podcast. I am so happy to have you here. You know, motherhood is hard, and we are going to talk about all of the hard things that just are not talked about enough. So buckle up and enjoy this episode. Hi, Jillian.
Hi, Megan.
Thank you again for being here. So everyone out there listening, we have Jillian Carter here from Milk Matters, and we are going to talk today about the ups and downs of feeding babies, all about breast milk, and, you know, just putting some knowledge and advice out there and, you know, resources that any mom can use at any point in their breastfeeding journey. So I'm so excited for this. Jillian, why don't you start us off and tell us a little about you? Who's Jillian?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, Megan. I'm really excited to be here. I've been listening to your podcast, and I am so in love with it already and feeling like, this is information that we need to get out there. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So as Megan said, I'm Jilian Carter. I am a lactation consultant, an IBCLC, so an International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. I'm the owner of Milk Matters Lactation, which is a private practice lactation support service that we offer home visit lactation support. We actually have 7 lactation consultants on my team, from Queens to Queensbury. So as far south as Queenstown, the city, and as far north as Queensbury. And I actually live in Cohoes, New York, so just a little bit north of Albany.
Nice. So, wow, that's huge. 7 people under you? That's a big business.
Yeah.
I love that it's just like spreading all through New York, you know, just like the help. I mean,
I feel
it's
like
so good.
Out of control, but we're having fun.
That's awesome. So, Jillian, when did you start your business, and like, how did your motherhood journey bring you to this point in your life?
Yeah. So, you know, I think that for a lot of lactation consultants, their lactation work starts with their own journey, their own breastfeeding experience, but that really wasn't the case for me. So for me, back in 2010, I was working at a local hospital, St. Peter's Hospital in Albany, New York, as a postpartum nurse. So I started that job in 2010, and I was a postpartum nurse on night shift. I was supposed to be helping these moms with feeding their babies, and I had no idea what to do or how to help them at all. I really found myself like repeating what I heard other nurses tell the patients, which basically meant I was like telling everybody to drink a lot of water and didn't really know what else to say. So I heard about a training that was being offered locally. So I signed up for that training, and it was just a 1-week class with a test at the end. But that class was just kind of basic breastfeeding support. At the end, I was certified as a certified lactation counselor, a CLC, which is like an entry-level certification for lactation support. And that class was a really great help to my work at the hospital. So I was still a postpartum nurse. I wasn't, working on their lactation staff, but I was able to, provide much better help, especially on night shift when the lactation consultants were not available at that time.
Right.
And then through a few years of working in that role, I was able to get enough clinical hours to qualify for the exam. So to become an IBCLC. So once I had my clinical hours, I took some additional coursework and then had to sit for boards and pass the boards and became an IBCLC. So that's the certification that I hold now.
Okay.
So along the way in there, I did have a baby.
Okay.
But my lactation work really started years before that. It was really just that I saw a need in the families that I was caring for on the postpartum unit, and I wanted to fill that need.
Yeah.
And,
That's huge. I mean, I definitely had that need, when I had my daughter.
Mhm.
And I love like all the stories that I've been hearing, through the podcast and whatnot. A lot of the businesses come from, women just recognizing that need in other women and, turning it into a business and helping others. And I love that. Like, gives me goosebumps because I mean, I
Yeah.
feel like we've all come from somewhere, whether we had our own struggles or saw other people struggle. And it's really great just to see that. Being able to put more resources out there for women. Now, so I guess with the 2 certifications, I'd love to clarify. So like,
Mhm.
so when people are looking for a lactation consultant, should they look for the higher certification or like, what would you recommend?
So yeah, there are different levels for different needs, right? So a CLC is totally equipped to do like a breastfeeding class, to do really, some basic support. But anything that goes beyond the CLC scope of practice, they should be then referring someone to an IBCLC. And if you already know that you have a situation that's more unique, that you're not just looking for some general guidance, but that you're looking for uh, something related to a medical condition for yourself or your baby, then an IBCLC is probably better equipped. IBCLC is generally the highest level of professional lactation support, so it's recognized that way.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that because I think
Yeah,
that can be a little bit
it is so
confusing.
confusing. Yeah.
Okay. When do you think is the best time to find your lactation consultant? Because I mean, I recommend like all my postpartum moms like get a lactation consultant. Just
Yeah.
because I wish I had one. I think it would have been so helpful for me. What is it good to find one like before you're having the baby?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really love it when clients are able to establish care with me about
Mm-hmm.
2 months prior to delivery. That gives us time. We do a prenatal consult, and that's an opportunity to evaluate their medical history, see if there's any challenges that we can anticipate, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there are some clues that we have from someone's medical history or something about how their anatomy is changing during pregnancy that can tell us something about what challenges they may face after delivery. So if we can anticipate and then plan for that in advance, that, as you can imagine, is a huge help.
I know.
And then also during that prenatal consult, we would like talk about equipment, pumps. If somebody anticipates they may need a nipple shield, we would talk through those things, how to use it properly. But the most valuable part of connecting ahead of time during pregnancy is really just that the client has access to their lactation consultant as soon as they're home from the hospital. So
Yes.
I'll usually ask clients to even send me a quick text when they're on their way to the hospital or when they're in labor or when, like as soon as they get a chance.
Yeah.
And then we typically set up that initial visit whenever possible for like the day after they come home from the hospital.
Okay.
So I'm often seeing people on day 3, 4, or 5 of the baby's life, and that is a critical time. Days 3, 4, and
Okay. Yeah,
5
I was gonna
are
ask you so is that because that's when the milk comes in, or like,
right.
okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
even though the baby's already nursing at the hospital and
Mhm.
whatnot, it doesn't really matter until they get home, like those 2 to 3 days after, or what do you?
No, I mean absolutely. The work that they're doing in the hospital helps too, but often there is lactation support there,
Okay.
and some problems don't show up in at the very first couple of days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we see on day 3, 4, or 5 that that may be a key time frame when the mother may be experiencing some nipple injury, some damage that may have happened in the hospital. We can see whether or not that's healing. If they're having pain with a latch at that point, then we want to really dig into like what is causing this pain and how can we resolve it as quickly as possible. The baby is kind of in an important stage there, days 3, 4, and 5 as well, because typically the mom's milk is changing on right about 72 hours after delivery. So 3 days out from delivery, from colostrum to a more mature milk. And that shift is what we often think of as, people often say, like the mom's milk comes in, right?
Okay.
So before that point, the baby's getting colostrum, the baby may be getting plenty to eat there, but this dramatic volume uptick is
Mm.
changes everything, kind of,
Yeah.
So the there are a couple of things that we're looking for on days 3, 4, and 5. One is, did that happen, right?
Mm.
So if we're on day 3 or 4 or 5 and the mom hasn't yet experienced that dramatic increase in volume, then that's something we want to pay very close attention to. in terms of, is it coming at some point here, or, what's causing this delay? And we want to be paying close attention to the baby, because the baby's kind of built for an increase in volume at day 3. And if
Right.
now we're on day 4 and that hasn't happened yet, the baby easily can get dehydrated. So
Okay.
that could be, dehydration for a baby is very dangerous, but very easily solved. So long as we're catching it, we're totally fine. And so that's why that's a good time for us to stop in.
So I guess I didn't realize that the milk wouldn't come in. So that actually happens? Like, so why is that?
Yeah. So usually the milk volume should increase at 72 hours. It's related to hormones. It's impacted much less than people often expect by how much breastfeeding the baby has done in those first few days.
Okay.
How frequently the baby feeds in the first few days is going to help support adequate milk supply going forward, but is less important for the timing of when the milk actually shows up.
Okay.
So that increase in milk volume should happen at 72 hours, just triggered by hormones. And if somebody experiences that they just didn't get that fullness at all, or they got a little bit of fullness and then it went away, or they got, very slow, gradual increase in volume, those things all could be caused by different things. So the dramatic increase all of a sudden over the course of a few hours, starting at 72 hours, that's what we would expect.
Okay.
Things that typically throw it off, the most common ones are high blood pressure during delivery, or at the end of pregnancy, or after delivery.
Okay.
Or high blood loss. So in the example of high blood loss, you can imagine your body has to replenish that blood supply. And the ingredients in breast milk and the ingredients in blood are actually pretty much the same.
No way. I did not know that. That's amazing.
It's a lot of water, and it's, various nutrients and things. And so if your body needs to make that choice of like, I've got to replenish the blood first, and I will get around to making milk later. And it's, not quite that simple, but, that's kind of a way that I think helps to think of it that way.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, when people have like a C-section or like a really traumatic birth, would that happen more often in like those types of births than just a regular vaginal birth?
Yeah. It kind of depends. In general, with a C-section, we expect a higher blood loss than with a vaginal delivery. So it can impact in that way. Also, just depending on how much opportunity your body had to prepare for delivery, we sometimes see a difference between a parent who labored up to the point of pushing and then needed a C-section. Their body's a little bit more prepared because it went through all those stages. Whereas somebody who had what we would call like a cold C-section, right? Meaning it was, yep, this is my third baby and they're all C-sections and this is the third one. And so we're just going to schedule it.
Right.
And you go in that morning and have the C-section, but your body didn't necessarily
go through all of those actions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that totally makes
Sometimes
sense.
there's a delay from that. Yep.
Okay. So talking about breast milk and how you get the colostrum, am I saying that right?
Colostrum, yeah.
Yes.
Colostrum.
And then, so I never knew this until like last year when I was, just getting more educated on breastfeeding, about the foremilk and the hind milk. Like I was never taught that, my daughter's almost 8, so this was like a while ago. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between these parts of our breast milk?
Yeah, sure. So the terms colostrum, foremilk, and hind milk are all just ways to describe breast milk. Okay. So they're kind of different types, but not even necessarily different types. You might also hear people use the terms mature milk or transitional milk. It's all breast milk, but you can kind of think of it as like different recipes. Okay. So the colostrum is the first recipe that your body is following. Starting during pregnancy, your body begins to produce colostrum, produce breast milk following the colostrum recipe.
Okay.
And it's thick and it's sticky and it's like very concentrated, very, very dense. Your body continues to use that recipe on all through the end of your pregnancy and then through the first few days after delivery. And then what I just mentioned as the kind of timeline of milk coming in is usually about 72 hours after delivery. And at that point, your body is changing the recipe. So sometimes people think of it as, oh no, what will happen if the colostrum runs out before the milk comes in, right? And it doesn't work
Okay.
that way. It's not like there's a set amount of colostrum and then there's a gap and then the milk comes in.
Okay.
Rather, your body's continually producing breast milk, and it's just following colostrum recipe for the first few days, and then it's switching over to a mature milk recipe, but it actually kind of overlaps and produces this kind of transitional milk for a little bit in between.
Very good.
So that's what the parent experiences, is that abrupt milk coming in. So that's colostrum, transitional milk, and mature milk.
Okay.
Now, fore milk and hind milk is has a little bit of drama around it, because it's the kind of it's a topic that lactation consultants find valuable to know something about, but it easily becomes a topic that when the general public starts learning about fore milk and hind milk, there can sometimes be a lot of talk about it on the internet, and it gets stirs up a lot of excitement, and people start to be very concerned they have too much fore milk and not enough hind milk, or they need to change the timing of their feeding in a way, or the way that they switch sides in order to get babies the adequate amount of hind milk instead of fore milk, right? So you know what I'm talking
this is
about.
perfect. Let's squash this. Let's put this information out there so we can all understand.
So they're really the concept, just to give people who've never heard of any of this, right? So the concept is that the theory is that fore milk is kind of fore, so it's at the beginning of the breastfeed, and the hind milk comes at the end of the breastfeed, and that the fore milk, in theory, is less fat dense. So meaning there's just, there's less fat in it. It's much more watery, right? People sometimes will call it skim milk. Okay. And then the hind milk that comes at the end of the feed is creamier, and that has all the fat. Now, here's where the little piece of truth comes in this. Okay. The way the breastfeeding works is your body has all these little milk ducts inside the breast. They are like little pockets of milk. You can picture it like upside down grapes. Okay. And in each of the grapes, it's producing milk. Now, when your body first, when the baby begins to breastfeed at the start of an individual breastfeed, and your body goes to release that milk, it's initially releasing the milk that's like most easily accessible to it, right? That flows most easily. And so it just kind of, the milk that comes out first is the more watery milk, I guess, right? The fat tends to stick to the inside of like each of those little grapes. Okay. And so the idea is that the less fatty milk would flow first, and that the more fatty milk would kind of come toward the end after it's kind of forced to detach from the sides. That can be resolved entirely by doing a little bit of breast massage. Okay. So I always encourage my patients, not always, because there are times when it's actually not appropriate, but most of the time I encourage clients to do just a little bit of light breast massage, not digging in deep, just really lightly with their own hand, going around on their breast and encouraging the milk to flow by just doing a little bit of light compression. That typically resolves this issue of fore milk and hind milk entirely.
Like them being separated. They're almost, then it just comes out together.
Yeah, it just kind of mixes it up. It helps those little fat globs to detach a little bit more easily so that it's all just there.
Okay.
Wow, the other issue with it is
so simple.
As they've tried to research this at times, you will see sometimes on the internet, someone will post, here's the first 5 minutes of my pumping session and the second 5 minutes of my pumping session. They'll collect it in 2 separate bottles, and you'll see that the fat in the second part of the pumping session was so much thicker, right? And that is evidence that is true for that person. But that is not necessarily typical. So when they've tried to research this and did that exact study of saying, okay, we'll have you pump and then switch bottles and then pump the rest, does it make a difference? It's all over the place. So yes, there are some people that have fattier milk toward the end of the feed, or at least toward the end of the pumping session. We can't really measure it specifically in a feed, so we're kind of guessing based on how it works with pumping. But that's not true of everybody. That's not true of even most people. It is really just sometimes the case. So it's something for a lactation consultant to be aware of in case a baby's showing symptoms of this. But very often when the symptoms that people think of as associated with fore milk, hind milk imbalance, often those symptoms go along with lots of other things too. So it can be.
What would be symptoms of this? Like they're hungry more if they're not getting the fatty milk, or?
Sometimes if if somebody was like feeding just a little bit on each breast and limiting the feed, then a baby might not be growing well. They might be needing to feed more frequently. But I would expect in that case, the parent probably would just let baby stay on longer and get enough anyway.
Right.
More often it has to do with like green stools that, so where we do see it as a problem is somebody that has a very high oversupply, meaning they're making way too much milk and the baby is getting just, say a quarter of the milk that's available to them in the breast and leaving all the rest behind, right? So
Okay.
if somebody was, their routine practice was they latched the baby, then they took the baby off after 5 minutes, and then they pumped the rest of the milk out, we might see that baby, even though the mom has this huge milk supply, the baby might actually be getting just that milk that they get at the start of the feed, and then a lot of the fat is ending up in what she's pumping and storing or donating or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I have heard that about an oversupply, and I did have questions on here for you about it. So I feel like a lot of people, or whenever we're going into having especially our first babies, we're like, drinking all these special teas and like making sure we're going to have like tons of breast milk. Is that like a positive thing to have an overproduction, or would you say no?
I mean, it's really not. And people expect that it would be, it's the kind of thing that people anticipate would be like a nice problem to have.
Right.
So often when I'm talking with parents at the start, I might be giving them some guidance related to avoiding pumping for a period of time at the beginning to avoid inducing an oversupply. And there are times when, excuse me, there are times when I see a parent who looks at me when I say, well, we want to make sure that you don't end up with an oversupply. And they kind of give me this look like, I mean, maybe I want an oversupply.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's hard for a parent, which I'm sure you see, to not be able to have enough, or like, I mean, I remember thinking of it as like gold. I spilled a bottle one time and I like cried about it because I was like, I worked so hard for that, so to have the oversupply and like always have that around. And if you're going back to work, it probably feels like a security blanket, but that's why this is so interesting. Yeah. So it's not good.
No, well, I mean, absolutely. It can be really nice to like have that extra milk and know that it's always there and not have to worry about it. But the problems that come up with it are typically having recurrent plug ducts, so an area of your breast that doesn't empty well, and sometimes mastitis, which is a breast infection that doesn't get treated well, or just, that kind of gets out of hand, develops into an abscess that can sometimes then require like surgical drainage. So it really can go become a huge problem. I mentioned already that like formil kind milk issue comes up sometimes when we have a very high oversupply. And just in general, those are parents that are kind of uncomfortable all the time. Like they make too much milk, and even, their baby starts to sleep a little bit longer at night, and they find that like, oh wow, the baby can sleep 7 hours, but then they find that they're waking up at 5 hours because they have to pump.
Right.
They have to do something to empty their breast because they're so uncomfortable.
Right.
So I generally try to help my parents to have a full supply. And if they have like, one step, on the higher end of a full supply, that's lovely. Then it's a nice place to be. They can just pump an extra bottle anytime that they need to. And it certainly takes some of that pressure off, especially with return to work and that kind of thing. So that's generally what we're aiming for as the sweet spot. We don't want
That's a great spot to be. I mean, what advice would you give to, so prenatal care, like what would you advise women to do to be able to have a full supply?
There's not a whole lot to do prenatally. Sometimes we can see things prenatally that in a parent's medical history that would indicate that they might be at increased risk for a low supply. The biggest one would simply be if they had experienced low supply with a previous pregnancy. So if they had a breastfeeding experience in the past and struggled to create enough milk at the time, then that's something that we want to look into very closely and see, were these things that were caused by kind of external factors, or was it nothing that could be explained externally and really there's something anatomically that caused that?
Okay.
If that's the case and it's something physiological, then it's likely to be a problem again. And so that's something that we're just going to be much more aggressive about right from the start. Mostly the interventions that we do are things that have to wait until after delivery. So there's not really much to do during pregnancy. But we have,
because it's supply on demand, right? So like what should women do immediately after birth? I mean, I always hear kind of different advice, but obviously skin to skin is a great
Mhm.
thing to do. Now,
Yeah, absolutely.
how long do you recommend doing that after birth?
So skin to skin has lots of benefits for the baby. You put the baby right against your chest, with their chest bare, right against your chest bare, and that helps the baby maintain appropriate temperature. It helps them to regulate their breathing, and it helps them to manage their blood sugar in that very first critical time,
Okay.
that hour, especially after delivery. So it can be really helpful to put the baby skin to skin. It also has benefits for breastfeeding. And most of the time, if you put a baby skin to skin and they're healthy and the mom's well and everybody's doing okay, at the end of that first hour, sometime by the end of the first hour of skin to skin time, the baby will latch themselves on. If they don't, it can be helpful to leave them there, let them remain skin to skin until they get a chance to breastfeed and finish that breastfeed on their own.
Okay.
And some hospitals will have policies that really are supportive of leaving the baby undisturbed through that period of time, because there are so many benefits to it. So
Okay.
skin to skin definitely helps with kind of getting off to a good start.
Awesome.
And then just feeding the baby on cue, so that whenever the baby asks to eat, you feed the baby. Each period of breastfeeding can kind of be divided into these different chunks of time.
Okay.
And the guidance for each of them is really different. So that's something in general that I think is confusing to parents, is that they'll hear somebody say, never wake a sleeping baby, right?
Yes.
But that is not at all appropriate guidance for day 2 or 3 or 4, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and they'll hear somebody else say, yeah, you can expect the baby has to feed every 1 hour, and that's normal. That is normal sometimes. There are periods of time when it is okay for a baby to be feeding every 1 hour.
Right.
But if you have a 1-month-old who's still feeding every 1 hour, that's something I want to look into a little bit more and see, why is the baby needing to feed that frequently to get enough? So,
Right.
so the what's normal at one stage isn't necessarily normal all the time,
Okay.
and what's appropriate guidance for one stage isn't necessarily helpful all the time. So, yeah, that's kind of wandering around your question a little bit, but I just wandered a little bit, I hope.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, because I mean, obviously these babies are growing and changing so rapidly, they're going to have different needs.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, keeping up our supply, well, I mean, I don't have a supply, but
Yeah.
what would you recommend? I mean, obviously a healthy diet, lots of water. Like, what else would you recommend for women to be able to keep up their supply?
Yeah. So we have lots of tips and tricks for increasing supply if it dips. The first step is always going to be to identify the reason why the milk supply is low.
Okay.
So I meet a lot of parents who are doing everything. They're doing extra pumping after session, after breastfeeding. They're doing herbal supplements. They're doing teas. They're waking the baby to feed every 2 hours. And then what it comes down to is something as simple as how their pump flange fits them, or the settings that they're using on their pump, for better
Okay.
understanding their baby's feeding cues. And it's just, it's such a shame when they have spent weeks, driving themselves bananas, doing everything they could possibly find on the internet, or guidance they could get from friends or family, without ever really being able to identify what is actually going on. And that's the benefit of working with a lactation consultant, is that we're able to come in and say, okay, let's actually figure out what's causing this before we start throwing solutions at it that might not at all be appropriate for that situation.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's the benefits and the cons of the internet. It's great we have all this information, but it's also like a black hole and you don't know what is right for you. So that's why having a professional would be great. So I've heard you mention a couple times a flange for the pump. Now, how do you size someone for this? Like, I know I definitely made this mistake. Mine was too small and it ended up like tearing my nipple a little bit. It was awful. So like, what's your advice towards the flange? Because it sounds very important.
So pump flange sizing is something that we've learned a lot about in the lactation community over, I think, maybe the last 4 or 5 years. And largely it was helped by a company called Maymom that's, I want to say in North Korea or South Korea. I'm not sure where they're located, maybe Taiwan. Anyway, so they are a company that makes smaller size flanges for pumps. And there's other ones as well. Nini Supply is also available on Amazon. So when these new pump flange sizes came out and lactation consultants began experimenting with them, we found that many, many people need much smaller sizes than what we what comes with the pump at least.
Okay.
So most pumps come with like around a size 24 flange and often also a 27 or a 28, depending on the brand.
Okay.
Most people need something like a 17 millimeter size
Really?
flange. Yeah.
Maybe mine was too big then. I don't
So
even
it's a very common mistake for people to try out one size of the flange and think, oh, this is too small because I can see the sides of my nipples rubbing on the inside of the tunnel. Okay.
Okay.
And when we look at it, we what we can recognize often is that it's not actually the sides of the nipple rubbing against the tunnel. It's that the areola itself, so the dark part around the nipple, is getting drawn into the tunnel of the pump flange, and that's what you're seeing rubbing. And it will be very painful, and it will leave a ring around the nipple, and that's actually an indication that the flange is too big. So generally, so we've kind of gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So now we've kind of like gotten to a place where most lactation consultants who are up in their practice would be sizing someone for really the smallest flange size that they can comfortably use. So anything that fits pretty snugly, it draws in only the nipple and not any of the areola.
Okay.
And maybe we should clarify too.
That is total opposite of what it is. So that's amazing. I mean, that's great information to put out there. Because I mean, if we're why do you think the companies that offer the pumps are putting these bigger flanges out there? Like, why would they do that?
So, I mean, for years and years, like I said, it's just in the last few years that that the lactation community has kind of figured this out. And as with most things, like, one specialty will figure something out, but it takes a while for mass marketing to catch up. Okay. There is one company, there are a couple companies now that are offering smaller sizes. So I think that Medela now is providing with their pumps, instead of doing 24 and 27 is what they always used to do. And now they're doing 24 and 21 as the two sizes that come standard with their pumps. So that's a good sign that they got down to 21s, but now, we used to say 21s and now we're saying like, actually, I think more 17s are the average. So and there are, LV is another pump company. And I saw just recently on their site that they now have cushions for their pumps that allow it to go down to even smaller, as small as a 15 millimeter flange size. Okay. So,
so it's really not the size of the breast then. It's like you said, so it's more of the areola and the nipple. That's what because I mean, I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, well, my boobs are huge. Like I need a bigger flange, but that's not the case you're saying.
Yep.
Okay. Wow. I love it.
About breast size at all. Yeah. But often people do. They think like I have larger breasts, so I need to use the biggest size that's available for the flange. But it really comes down to only the diameter of the nipple that matters.
Yep. Wow. Amazing. I love it. Now, I guess my next question is, how do you know your baby is getting a full feed? Obviously, we know like weight gain and whatnot, but I think like, especially in my industry where I'm a sleep consultant, pediatric sleep consultant, I always like to make sure your baby's getting a full feed, because if they're not getting a full feed, they're not going to sleep well. But it's like, how can people recognize this?
Yeah, so it can be hard. When I come out to a client's home to do a lactation consult, we are going to weigh the baby before and after the feed to know exactly what they had to eat. So we can use that as, an example of like one feed one time during my visit. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if the baby took, 2.5 ounces at that feed, that they get 2.5 ounces at every other feed, right?
Right.
So, but it at least gives us one data point so that we can at least use that as a marker. So if the mom tells me this is one of the best feeds the baby's ever done, and we're at 2.5 ounces, then we can say, okay, that's kind of their max of what they can do. Versus if it's the baby only took one side, they're kind of sleepy, they're a little out of it.
Right.
Then, okay, so is this a bigger or smaller feed for that baby?
Okay.
It can be hard to know exactly when the baby is, exactly what the baby had to eat, but we really generally don't need to know what did the actual volume of milk add up to for this baby. It usually can just be a matter of, is the baby satisfied? So I generally will say I'd like a baby to feed at least 5 minutes on each breast, right? That doesn't mean the mom takes the baby off after 5 minutes, but simply if the baby's eating less than 5 minutes on each breast, that's something I want to look into more closely. And if the baby is taking longer than 45 minutes to finish the feed, they seem like they're still not really done. They haven't come off on their own. They're still sucking and it's 45 minutes in. That's a baby that I want to look into a little bit more closely too and see why is the baby taking so long. So, you can kind of do it generally based on a general sense of how long it takes your baby to eat. I do usually prefer that the baby takes both sides unless we're intentionally trying to limit a mom's milk supply.
Okay.
And usually the parent can feel the difference in their breast, that before versus after the feed.
Yes.
It's much softer after the feed. So.
Okay. Now, do you think each child is different in the way they eat, or is it like all very similar?
Yeah, no, I think if there's differences for every baby and every parent, every baby and
Yeah.
every parent is unique. And that's, where it can be really helpful to work with a lactation consultant to
Right.
really customize a plan and not just rely on, the general guidance that's out there.
Okay. I mean, I always see that in my kiddos that I work with. So I was just
Yeah.
curious if it goes the same for eating as well.
Yeah.
Now, cluster feeding. I feel like this comes
Mhm.
up a lot. Is this a real thing? Is it like, tell us about this?
Absolutely. So yeah, so you hear the term cluster feeding a lot, and people use it in different ways. So I want to kind of clarify
Mm.
what I mean by cluster feeding and what I usually use the term frequent feeding for. Okay. So sometimes people will talk about cluster feeding as just the baby's feeding very, very frequently. The baby is kind of seeming unsatisfied and they're eating, and an hour later they're eating again, and a half an hour later they're eating again. That very, very frequent feeding is normal at some stages, but only at some very specific stages. So we often see this on day 2 of life when the baby's kind of learning how to feed. They're often kind of getting in as many practice sessions as they can in that time frame. So they're getting in lots and lots of feeding, usually on day 2. They usually will continue that very frequent feeding until the mom's milk volume increases. So when the parent experiences that fullness, that milk coming in at 72 hours, usually then it should kind of resolve. Now the baby gets a few good feeds and then realizes like, okay, it's not going away. I can calm down and I can feed every 2 or 3 hours and that can be fine, right?
Okay.
The other time that we see frequent feeding is just during growth spurts. So a baby may just feed especially frequently for a couple of days while they're doing some extra growing, and then they'll return to their normal pattern after that. So all of those things I would consider to be frequent feeding and kind of the normal time frames for that. Cluster feeding is what the term I use to describe when a baby will, in the evening, do feeds close together for the purpose of allowing them to do a longer sleep stretch at night.
Okay.
So usually we'll see, you're a sleep consultant, all about this, right? They have
Yes.
to kind of tank up a little bit to get.
It like blows my mind how like intuitive they are with this.
Yes.
I love it.
They know, right?
They know. Yes.
So you'll see this as the baby starts to feed, wants to feed at 6 p.m. and then again at 7 and 8 and 9. And then, so they may feed every hour for about 4 hours, and then they'll sleep for like 5 hours. Okay. Now, this is not appropriate. In my opinion, this is not appropriate for a baby that's less than 4 weeks old. Okay.
Yes.
So usually they are not doing these longer sleep stretches in the first month. And then at about 4 weeks old or so, they do a growth spurt. After that growth spurt is when they're ready for cluster feeding.
Okay.
Cluster feeding is a good thing because cluster feeding is what makes it possible for those longer sleep stretches.
Yes. Yes.
If your baby is a month old or older and is doing this very frequent feeding in the evening, but not doing any of those longer sleep stretches, that's a baby I want to look at more closely to see what is going on, because the normal pattern I think would be to do frequent feeds for a short period of time each evening, for a period of time each evening, and then like 5 hours or so. So that's cluster feeding. They clustered their feeds together into the evening
I'm
hours.
glad I had that right. I did. I mean, I did my research, but I just feel like cluster feeding means a lot of different things, like you said, for different people. And I just think clarifying and putting that out there.
And I think professionals use it differently too. I think some professionals will talk about like, oh, that second day cluster feeding. I'm like, well, not really cluster feeding. I mean, it's, okay.
Right. They're just getting the hang of things. Yeah. Well, and I feel like after that 4-week mark too, they're starting to get a biological clock. They're starting to recognize the time a little bit differently, so they can understand that, all right, mom really wants me to sleep at night. She's getting a little frustrated with me. So maybe I should eat a little bit more and, try to sleep a little bit longer. I mean, kids are just so smart. It's mind blowing. It really is. But yeah, I love that.
It can be helpful, I think, to know that that's normal and expected, and this is the timeline of it, because it allows parents to embrace it a little bit more when that cluster feeding is happening. as opposed to sometimes parents will be like, I don't know, they want to feed very frequently, so I'm giving the pacifier, I'm trying to hold them off for the next feed, blah, blah, blah. But then they're missing the opportunity. Like the baby, if they allow the baby to feed very frequently, it allows them to do that longer sleep stretch. If they hold off the baby with the pacifier in those evening hours, there are definitely times that pacifiers can be very appropriate to use, but if they're doing it sometimes in that time when the baby is trying to tank up, then they're limiting how much the baby gets to eat in that time, and the baby can't go longer sleep stretch.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that time of day is so hard. I feel like, it's like we get that extra 5 hours of sleep or 4 or 5 hours, but it's also like, around 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, especially if you have other children, or it's just like you're exhausted by that time. It's been a long day of feedings and, naps and whatnot. It's such a hard time of day to be like, oh, now they want to eat every half an hour. Like what? But I guess if you kind of have that in the back of your head that, all right, they're going to sleep a little bit longer, at least they're working towards that, it can give you a little hope, in those like really tough moments.
I can't guarantee it. I can't promise the 5 hours.
I know.
It's coming.
It's coming. Yeah. Do you feel like cluster feeding makes them a little bit more of an efficient eater, as they're tanking up and eating?
I don't know if it impacts the efficiency much. Usually for efficiency, I talk to parents about breast compression. So I mentioned that earlier with the hind milk and foremilk. Just doing some light breast compression during the feed really can help a lot with getting a baby to empty the breast fairly quickly. And, if this is baby number 2 and you've got the toddler running around, it can make a difference.
Make it a little bit quicker. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So breastfeeding a baby, so obviously not everyone does that, but I saw a statistic that it said like 83% of people usually start off breastfeeding, but the time a baby is 6 months old, it drops down to like 24%. Like, why do you think this is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the statistics specifically, but it's something like that for sure. There's a lot of parents, most parents that intend to breastfeed, plan to breastfeed, and then are often surprised by challenges that come up and are unprepared. And that's no fault of their own. Even if they had prepared as well as they could, sometimes things don't go the way that they had prepared for.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a matter of reaching out for support and just not finding that it's there.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I started this business because there was a total lack of lactation support in the capital region. Yeah. There were some breastfeeding support groups and a couple of lactation consultants that would come to your home kind of somewhat informally, but there really wasn't much else. I'm happy to report that Milk Matters has been here now for 4 years, and we've seen a great increase in the number of lactation supporters available that will come to people's homes and take insurance and, kind of have this availability that just didn't exist just a few years ago. But that's the biggest thing when they look into the research of like, why is this happening? Why aren't parents able to meet the goals that they set for themselves? It really comes back to support time and time again. So having more people available, having insurance cover lactation support consistently and reliably, and knowing that parents can count on that, it makes all the difference.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely support, and I think like determination on some level for the mom to just really stick through, because it does get easier. I feel like in the beginning it's so hard, those first couple months. But it does get a lot easier. But that support, I wish I had you. And I'm so happy to just see so much more support out there now. Just like as the years go on, it's like more and more and more. And just like us putting out these little things that maybe aren't talked about at a breastfeeding class, it's just so helpful. And I hope it's encouraging too to people to just like continue on, keep doing it, reach out, get support. There's so many people out there that want to help. Even if you're not in the New York area, I'm sure more people out there too.
You really can just Google lactation consultant near me, and somebody will come
there
up.
You go. Perfect. And I think there are free groups as well, right? If they can't afford it, or
absolutely. So there's oftentimes the hospital will offer for patients to come back to the hospital to see their lactation consultant team there. So sometimes they can get some help that way, or they can meet with breastfeeding support groups. So there's the hospitals sometimes offer a breastfeeding support group. There's also the baby cafes. So if you go to, I think it's babycafeusa.org. I hope that's right. Put the
It's
link
something
in
like
the
that.
show
I'll
notes.
find it and I'll link it below. But yes, I think
Yeah.
you're right. Yes.
And there's also the Late J League, which is another organization that's been around for decades. And both of those usually offer, free support to families who are breastfeeding. So yeah.
Amazing. And I thought, did you say that our insurance will cover
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
now?
So
Okay.
we're in network with CDPHP, United Healthcare, and Aetna at this time. And there are other lactation consultants in this area that have arrangements with other insurance companies to have additional. So generally, insurance should be covering lactation visits, and it's really just a matter of getting the right lactation consultant that is
Okay.
in network, so that you're
Okay. So really your advice would be search around and find someone that will cover.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's amazing. I mean, I love seeing that because I know I talked to an OT about, like pelvic floor care
Yeah.
after having a baby, and they're trying to get that bill passed as well to have insurance cover, you get pelvic floor care immediately after birth. I want to do the same for sleep support because like you said, you love when people come before they have the baby. And if people came and talked to me before they had a baby, before they have sleep issues, it would never be a problem.
I know.
So
yeah.
it's hard though. I get it. You don't reach out until you have a problem, and that's just how we are. But I'm hoping to really bring awareness to that and make changes with, sleep as well. Yeah. All of postpartum care.
Yeah.
Because it really is it's so important. It does. Yes.
You really need a full team.
Yeah.
And it's such a bummer to me when I meet with a client who's been struggling for months, and we get together and learn that she says, well, I couldn't afford it. And then I'm like, oh, you have CDPHP. All of your visits would be covered in full, and there's no cost to you at all. And she's realizing then that she could have had help so much sooner, but she just wasn't aware of that benefit. CDPHP does a pretty good job of sending out information to their clients, to their members, to make them aware of the benefit, but not all insurance companies.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, even right now, everyone listening in, check your insurance, see if you have that, because you might not even know that you have that support.
Right.
I also noticed it too, because I'm trying to get sleep support included in a lot of benefit packages, through corporate businesses. And, if you look at your corporate wellness package, a lot of them do supply breast milk support. Yeah. So, I think it is out there. Maybe we're just you might not think to look, within your insurance package. So, definitely look at that, because
it's really pushing a little bit too. Sometimes people will tell me that they called their insurance, and the rep that they talked to was like, no, I don't know. I don't think so.
No way. And they actually have it?
Yeah. So sometimes they just get misinformation if they look in one place. So it's a bummer to
it's kind of new, right? It hasn't always been supported by insurance companies. So
it's since the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act was that 2008?
2000.
Okay.
I don't know, somewhere around there. Yeah.
I feel like they should have caught up by now, but not everybody's up to speed. No.
Yeah, that was a while ago, maybe. I didn't know that, and my daughter was born in 2015, so, it's never too late to learn, so we're putting it out there now. All right, Jillian, so what advice can you give to mamas out there right now that might be struggling?
Yeah, really just getting the support that they need, and as much as possible getting that support set up ahead of time, and this is tough for somebody who's in the crisis right now, but for anybody that's pregnant or that is expecting to become pregnant, to be able to plan ahead for who are all the people that I'm going to need, and really to build that whole support system out, and not just count on my sister breastfed, so I'll just ask her,
Right.
But the same goes for so many things. It's not even just about breastfeeding. It's about sleep, and it's about, PT, and it's about pelvic floor, and it's about, all the things, right? We need support from professionals and from our friends and family, and, none of it can just get all put on our partners or something like that. So.
Right. And it's great to have mom friends, but everyone is different, right? So it's you need that professional support to really support your unique needs.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Because everybody's different, and your friend may say, whatever you do, don't forget to get enough milk stash for your return to work, right?
Right.
And then you're the one that ends up with the oversupply, and you're like, this is not what I needed to do. I started pumping way too early, right?
Right. Or even thinking that an oversupply is good, which we learned today isn't always the case. So get your education and find that professional and support for sure. Awesome. So where can we find you, Jillian?
So let's see. So I'm at milkmattersny.com. Milk Matters is all one word, no space in it. So milkmattersny. Don't forget the ny.com. And it's the same on Instagram and on Facebook, Milk Matters NY.
Awesome. All right. So I will link that all below. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
all of the work that you do and for being here today.
Well, thanks again for this opportunity. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, it was so nice having you. I will be in touch soon.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jillian. Bye.